Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Our mainstream account tells us that in the earliest days of our civilization we built pyramids during the Bronze Age. After the Bronze Age, we slowly advanced to the time of the Roman Republic that eventually became the Roman Empire, and the sort of structures that we built changed radically. We advanced to building smaller structures that were not quite as geometrically precise as the earlier pyramids, and yet they're very fine structures with great domes and magnificent colossal forms to them that endure to this day. And let's also take time to appreciate the wondrous Roman roads, many of which that also continue to endure to this day. Everywhere we go around the land, we'll see the ruins of the previous civilization. And yes, that includes the United States and the Americas, even though it's called the New World. Although new as opposed to what is certainly a question of the day. Today we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The channel originally started with the charter of examining numerous different theories. And you can go back and watch the video that's linked in the description of this video called The Grand Theories of Tartaria and the Old World, in which we explored the many different theories that could explain the existence of pre-existing civilizations that were not explained in the mainstream. Think about the aspect of a cemetery. You believe that a cemetery gives you validation that the history that you're told is accurate because every time someone you know passes away, they're buried in a cemetery with a date that's left on the tombstone. Therefore, older tombstones must be validation that what happened in the past historical account is accurate. Although would you be surprised to know that virtually every cemetery across the lands has been moved at some point in time for a variety of reasons. We have now advanced to building wondrous towers of glass and steel that cross the land. And yet, can we actually build these incredible pyramids that we did in the distant past during the Bronze Age? How does the mainstream account explain the construction of these pyramids? Indeed, we are derided for even questioning the account that we're given for how the pyramids were constructed. We are derided and told that it's merely a conspiracy theory. Yet at the same time, the mainstream tries to explain the pyramids with theories. In other words, they don't know for sure. But it's okay for them to come up with theories because their theories are validated by scientists, historians, archaeologists, and all the individuals with the appropriate credentials to do such things. So you look at the pyramids and you'll see that it's made up of many large stones that had to be moved. And they explain this by telling us that the quarries were nearby. They also have these wondrous images that we have that show human labor moving these great blocks. And then we have these beautiful animations that show us how they used a wonderful waterworks project to move these blocks and set them in place. And doesn't that illustration look great of those giant colossal people? And when you look at these illustrations and you have this wonderful account that tells you that water may have moved the blocks in place with human labor, it suddenly seems very believable, and you'll just accept it without asking questions. Of course, this image looks ridiculous. We could never build the pyramids like this today. So if we can't do it with human labor, and we base everything on this supposed representation from a governor of Egypt that existed 2,000 years before the year 0, or so we're told, and then it was some Greek individual who came up with a theory on how they moved the blocks using ramps, even though he was theorizing about an event that occurred 2,000 years before he was alive, and then this Greek individual is also 2,000 years before our current time, I don't see any issues with the mainstream account of the pyramids. Now, if you want a different theory, we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The 5 eras theory examines the fact that there are civilizations that came before ours that we don't discuss, that the mainstream does not acknowledge. And the reason for that being is that because if you actually acknowledge the existence of other civilizations where people lived in a different fashion, then it completely detracts from your ability to maintain your control over the population. The eras that we talk about the most and we'll examine on the channel are the contemporary era, our current era, the 5th era, and the 4th era, or also known as the Tartarian era or the Monument era. These are the most dramatic eras to talk about, and we also have the most evidence. But we're also going to consider the foundation eras, the 1st through the 3rd eras. And we call them the foundation eras because they were the original foundations that both the 4th era and the 5th era were built on top of. And we can still see their remnants. Indeed, we speculate that the pyramids are actually the remnants of the 2nd era civilization, or the foundation era. And yet there are other examples of incredible geometric structures that endure. Consider what we have in the 5th era with our great cities of glass and steel, and yet something about them seems very disposable and uninspired. What's the primary form of architecture? We have nothing but wonderful brutalist architecture. Brutalist architecture, called as such because it is functional, and it's also cost-effective. What's truly intriguing to consider, though, about the prospect of brutalist architecture is how it's risen across the world, and its heyday was considered after World War II in both the United States and the Soviet Union. And despite the fact that these were two diametrically opposed ideologies and nations, for a variety of reasons, they somehow embraced the same type of architecture, supposedly at different times and for different reasons that happen to support their respective economic systems. Even in Pittsburgh, where we saw the beautiful Cathedral of Learning, we have this wonderful glass tower that we can look at and we can act like it really compares with the Cathedral of Learning. And then we have many other wondrous structures where great residences live in. It looks nice and rounded and cubed and very, very boring. Sometimes you have to remember, though, that there is inspired architecture in brutalist architecture. It looks like we have what appears to be some sort of broken down TIE fighter here. And what does it represent? I don't know. Looking at the rest of the architecture, you need go no further than consider the dystopian film A Clockwork Orange. A Clockwork Orange, which talked about how a society repressed and controlled an individual, and it used this architecture quite effectively to show how individuals were controlled and how ultimately the violence that was inflicted on others was all at the behest of the government. And if you pay attention to the subtext in the movie A Clockwork Orange, you'll see that the architecture plays no small part in representing that. And there's no doubt about it that brutalist architecture can certainly reflect a dystopian flavor to a society, if you will. Now, is this going a little too far? Is this being a little too harsh on brutalist architecture? It has its place, it's functional, and it's cheap. At least that's what we'll be told. Although there are conflicting accounts given as to why it was embraced. For example, you'll be told that in the Western world, the United States, brutalist architecture was embraced because it was cheaper, and there was a demand for residences. And then in the Soviet Union, or the so-called communist bloc at the time, you'll be told that brutalist architecture was embraced because it was all for the good of the state, and it was for allowing individuals and workers to all have the same standard of living. And as much as we believe both of these diametrically opposed ideologies embracing the exact same architecture as the main reason for why we have numerous examples of brutalist architecture, we see that it represents the Fifth Era. And in fact, many offshoots of what they used to call brutalist architecture still exist to this day. And you need look no further in the United States than a Holiday Inn Express or any of these newer modern hotels or residential areas, where you can find that it's not really dystopian living, it's merely common sense. It makes perfect sense. It's cheaper. And it's always good to have disposable buildings. It's also good to have buildings with the fine functional lines of brutalism in the background for when you're engaging on your individual walks for fun. But why is brutalist architecture considered something that's an advancement? For two reasons. One, we're told that it reflected the economic realities in the entire world from the 1950s to the 1970s. And two, we're just told that it's a lot more practical. We don't want to build architecture that has an artistic appeal to it. Practicality, cost savings, and being economically viable. That's what really matters. And when you have a lot of people that need housing, you're going to shove them in very block-like housing units that all look the same. And this will inspire people. And indeed, the actual housing units that were used to film A Clockwork Orange still have that same dystopian look to them in the present. Now, it's my opinion. Perhaps this is a utopian appearance to you. Perhaps you think that that beautiful Freedom Tower in New York City is an improvement over the structures that preceded it. We've looked at the skyline of New York City in the early 20th century. And tell me, is there a comparison? Do any of these many residential high-rises actually compare to the previous residences that we had all over the Western world and the Eastern world from the times past? We'll be told that this was merely a necessity, that this was done for the good of people, that this represented the will of the people, not just in the United States, but in the Soviet Union. Now let's look at the Art Deco question. Is Art Deco from the Fifth Era or the Fourth Era? Art Deco is very intriguing because it has conflicting accounts for what it really represents. It has conflicting accounts for what styles actually go into Art Deco. When we look at Art Deco, though, we see something very different than brutalist or postmodern. We see an architectural style that reflects artistic inspiration, something that reflects a civilization that genuinely cares about the structures that it's building, that the structures are supposed to have more of a function than just be utilitarian, as we're relentlessly told that brutalist architecture serves. We see a style and a beauty in these Art Deco buildings that seem to speak to the human spirit. When you look at these buildings, you can't help but be impressed, and you feel that a lot more effort was put into their exterior and interior designs. You actually see the fact that there is the true human spirit that's reflected in these buildings. And oftentimes people will try to convince you that these buildings were all easily built primarily in the United States during the 1920s, and you can even find a great example of one built in the Soviet Union in the 1940s to the early 1950s. Yet, looking at the Art Deco style, you can see that there is something about it that is always awe-inspiring. And it's very difficult to accept the explanation that all these buildings were built with these very wonderful and convincing construction photos that we have. And even though this was only about 100 years ago, it still falls in a very ambiguous time. Did our civilization build these buildings? Or are we simply told that they built these buildings? How much of a deception do we have with the actual timeline? And can we really validate or verify anything? Now, it's very interesting to me because since I've done many of these explorations and we've primarily looked at many cities in the United States, we've started to look at cities in Europe and in Asia, we always have the same explanation and always have the same things that you see in the comments. And I'm going to let you in on something. There's actually a comment somebody could make that would convince me over 90% that any one of these Art Deco buildings were built by our civilization. But it's quite fascinating that not a single person has ever made that comment. And it's really quite simple, and I'm not going to tell you what that comment is. I'll let you know if somebody makes the comment. But you can find an example of it in one of the videos concerning an Iowa exploration because somebody made a comment that very convincingly showed that the 801 Grand Building in Des Moines was built by our civilization. And yet there's so many questions that come up with these Art Deco buildings. They continue to show the aspect of the civilization that preceded ours. I believe that by and large, most of these structures are from the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization that preceded our 5th era. And why do I think that? Because these buildings do reflect the style of what we would call the Old World. They have that artistic spirit, that inspiration in every single one of them. And it's not just on the exteriors of the buildings, it's also in the interior where you see how they reflect the once grandeur of civilization. A civilization that cared about the individual, not constantly being in a state of function or a state of misery, but being able to inspire the spirit on the inside. No doubt when you're in an Art Deco building as opposed to when you're in a brutalist architecture building, you can tell the difference. You can also compare and contrast how you feel when you stand outside an Art Deco building as opposed to a brutalist building. And when you see some of the examples of Art Deco, the explanation you'll be given from architects is that they had more of an artistic flair in the 1920s to incorporate all these incredible styles that even include Egyptian, strangely enough, because we do recall the civil courts building in St. Louis that we looked at that was modeled after the mausoleum of Helicanarsis, which supposedly doesn't have anything to do with Egypt, but it does. And that's according to the mainstream account. There's always these beautiful reliefs that also accompany Art Deco. The wondrous figures that you see depicted on the outside of the buildings. And these buildings have many different functions. Some are office buildings, some are municipal buildings, some are memorials, yet the style is reflected in the same. And while they try to tell us exactly what it's supposed to reflect, and of course they give us the hand wave explanation that the reason it reflects every civilization and culture across the world is because, of course, it incorporates every civilization and culture across the world. That's how you explain Art Deco. It's not because it's actually from a civilization that encompassed all the known lands. It's because somebody was trying to achieve cultural understanding in the 1920s, especially in the United States. The interiors of some of these buildings continue to inspire us. Now, why do I acknowledge the fact that some of these buildings may be questionable? Because we constantly run across the situation where we're told, we are assured in the same manner with repeated statements that many of these buildings, and here we look at the main building of the Moscow University, a questionable building, we're told that this individual, Joseph Stalin, was responsible for its construction. And once Joseph Stalin had passed on, then the Soviet Union completely embraced brutalist architecture. Indeed, it's an individual that we always explain it. Remember during the Kansas City exploration where we saw some very stunning Art Deco buildings, including the Power and Light building in the aptly named Power and Light District within Kansas City. I would be interested to see someone actually be able to build a building like this today. I would like to see someone build this very impressive theater that still endures with this very unique dome, again in Kansas City. Interesting patterns that we see in the windows, and of course the type of construction material that was used to establish the walls and the dome itself. And let's not forget the Kansas City Hall. The Kansas City Hall also being a stellar example of Art Deco. And where do you see it? You see it in the art reliefs, and you also see it in the walls of the building going all the way to the top. So you can prove that there is a skyscraper that's a lot more than just a functional building. You can see there are aspects of it that truly reflect a different civilization, unless we're to believe it's our own civilization. Kansas City has its own version of Joseph Stalin, Tom Pendergast. Tom Pendergast, who was a mafia and political machine organizer in Kansas City and supposedly responsible for the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Of course, it didn't save this particular individual from serving time in prison for tax evasion. So really, was Joseph Stalin and Tom Pendergast responsible for the Art Deco buildings, or were they just the people that we say are responsible? We have many photos of the construction of the Art Deco buildings, and supposedly we have many accounts. Although, oddly enough, no one seems to provide a first-person account. And now let's consider the Fourth Era proper. This is the era that we call the Tartarian era. This is the civilization that preceded ours. There was a hard reset that occurred in a time frame from 1750 to 1850, although it's hard to say for sure. We have wondrous examples of what the Tartarian civilization may have looked like. Very incredible architecture, stretching to the sky, various forms of producing power. We've explored it in great detail about how this pre-existing civilization managed to achieve a balance between both nature and the artificial implements of its civilization. It also managed to achieve the very elusive balance, for a time, between the individual and society. And that's something that our current civilization tends to go away from in every direction that you can imagine, especially given the fact that it oftentimes defaults to extreme polarizations and someone always having to be right and someone always having to be wrong. And you always have to embrace a belief now, and it's completely wrong to remain undecided about something. We'll still see examples of this Tartarian civilization even in some older images that we have, such as this image that may or may not have problems with it, of an airship docking with the Empire State Building. We also have other examples of airships docking with various towers. So is this really a brief technological fad according to our mainstream account? Or was this a real technological advancement that carried over from the Fourth Era civilization that had to be removed? We've looked at many examples of buildings that still stand to this day that we suspect are from this pre-existing civilization. Consider the Art Deco buildings that we looked at that are very likely from the Fourth Era civilization. We've also explored many libraries and municipal buildings in many cities, such as Terminal Tower in Cleveland. And many people will insist that they have numerous accounts, or because they worked a job in the building, that they can prove that it was constructed by our civilization, even though all we have are some very difficult to interpret images. And once again, we have, strangely enough, no first-hand accounts. Well, I understand the 1930s was a long time ago. And again, we have other images of this terminal tower. And many people will say that they just know, or they know someone who knows someone who knows someone, and that's what they'll say. And if that's good enough for you with the historical account, then by all means accept it. But yet you have many other structures that also seem to defy simple explanation by their incredible architectural style, and all supposedly built during the same time, such as the Masonic Temple in Detroit that we explored. Another wonder of the 1920s, when it seemed as though they built 75% of the buildings in every major city in the Midwest of the United States. We do have a construction photo of it, and once again we see that there are no issues with this construction photo. It is very convincing, and of course that's usually what you'll have when you explore these structures. Remember the wondrous interior that we looked at. And again, I believe this interior gives us true evidence of a pre-existing civilization that has been repurposed and used by the organizations in our current civilization. And here you look at this theater in the same structure, and again a very impressive and beautiful theater. Certainly there is nothing that we've built since the 1960s that remotely compares to this. This impressive structure in Cincinnati that will be told is an arch or waterworks, it is most certainly not a castle, because somebody says so. And in Cincinnati, where we have this impressive church from the 1840s next to the city hall. And of course the explanation will be given is that we had those crafty Germans that could build in Greco-Roman style and lay out a wonderful church like this in the 1840s with very impressive columns and the roof that we've seen. And there's absolutely no question about this. You just accept it. Or you can ask questions, such as looking at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, and realize that perhaps all the explanations that were given for who was truly responsible for these structures is not as simple or as cut and dry as it seems. Indeed, looking at the Fulton County Prison in Atlanta, or near what would become Atlanta, we can see evidence of a different civilization. Don't even bother asking why you'd need a tower on a prison like that, because it makes perfect sense. And now we look at the Foundation eras, the third to the first era. Now the Foundation eras may not seem as dramatic as either the Tartarian era or the Contemporary era because we don't have as much direct evidence. But we still have a lot of direct evidence that indicates that there was an era that preceded the civilization that came before us. And this is in the many examples that we have of what we call star forts, or as this channel refers to them now, geometrically precise foundation structures. And the reason we call them geometrically precise foundation structures on this channel is because they are very geometrically precise. We can tell that these are artificial constructs. And in every major city, there is some sort of documentation that indicates that there is a geometrically precise foundation structure that surrounds the city. And quite impressively so, we can find it in cities across the land. In cities in the United States, in Germany, in Russia, the former Soviet Union, across many other lands. And the explanation will be given for these geometrically precise foundation structures that surround the entire city is because it was good practice. They were defensible. It's how you would defend against cannonballs. And yet, conversely, you can find some structures that had signs of these geometrically precise foundation structures, or the smaller star forts, as you will, during the United States Civil War, which, strangely enough, were overrun or overtaken by a direct tactical military assault. So it's very strange. Once again, it's the example of a conflicting account. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's fine. You have these maps, and yes, perhaps they were just drawn. And yet we do have actual imagery that shows that these geometrically precise foundation structures at that scale are quite real. There are many examples of them across the entire land. And you can find them around cities, around old fortresses, or at least what we're told are old fortresses or castles, as there are so many castles, since everybody seemed to be able to afford to build one during what were called medieval times. And yet you can see the geometrical precision, and you can see the amalgamation of artificial with the natural. And perhaps this is also the explanation for the large and long, numerous so-called sandbars that we have that run for miles, and in some cases 40 to 50 miles. And you can also see the precision within the remaining structures. There are so many examples of these geometrically precise foundation structures that we can't simply explain, surrounding small towns, surrounding cities, the remnants of what used to be walls. Yet it's integrated with the terrain. And we can also tell that there are buildings that were built on top of these structures in the past. And that's where we get the title the Foundation Era from. It was the third era that the foundation that our previous civilization, the Tartarian era, and then our current era, built on top of, or in lieu of. And when you can see this across the land, and you can see so many examples, it completely contradicts the mainstream account that we're given. Also the fact that it's overgrown and it's integrated with nature. Now, of course, people say, well, there's a reason for it. It was just built before, and it was done with the ability to build walls because there were so many skilled construction individuals during the Middle Ages all the way up to the 1700s. And building these forts, regardless of logistical challenges, were never an issue. In fact, logistics is one of the greatest aspects that's hand-waved away. Now, they explain it with the Egyptian pyramids by saying that the quarry was right there. Well, it doesn't matter if the quarry was right next to the pyramids, which they try to tell us or imply that it was. You still have to cut all those blocks. You still have to move all those blocks, and you still have to form the pyramids, much as you have to form the land and the artificial structures of this geometrically precise foundation structure that goes around what appears to be this settlement and this structure. So is it really that simple to explain, or is it just a matter of accepting what you're told because it's the path of least resistance? And oftentimes that's what we find ourselves doing. And if you assess that's what you need to do to achieve happiness in your life is simply to capitulate to the will of others, then so be it. The second era gives us the example of where we have the pyramids from, and it no doubt reached heights that we can only begin to dream of. Now we suspect that there are a few remnants of the second era. We're told by the very same mainstream account that tells us of how the pyramids were constructed that they once had even more beauty to them, that they once appeared to have a great outer structure. But also imagine if they had this ability to build pyramids, what could they have achieved and how many ubiquitous structures could they have built using the geometric precision of pyramids? You also have to think in a much larger scale too, because while people will try to say that we never achieved a great building scale, yet we're still able to conceive a larger building scale. In other words, imagine pyramids that would start to match the size of hills or even small mountains, and then integrate a technological component with them. Integrate the aspect of power resources. And when you look inside the existing pyramids that remain, you see a very complicated architecture that went into establishing them. And of course we're told, well, it's because it was a tomb and the pharaoh liked their pyramids and they wanted to have a very elaborate tomb. And the thought of rebellion because they were facing death never crossed anyone's minds. Well, except for a few select individuals. But what if it was very different? What if this was a civilization that existed in even more balance between the individual and the society, and it achieved even more balance between nature and the artificial? And what if what we refer to as the Mayan civilization was actually just a component of the second era civilization? What if all the descendants that came from it and its long timeline actually came from the second era? Think on this. Instead of this being a less advanced civilization, this was a far more advanced civilization. Again, it flies right in the face of what we're given from the mainstream account that provides us depictions such as this. And depictions such as this, even though no one will ever do a practical experiment to prove how possible this is, that will convince us that this was how the pyramids were built. But what if they had construction techniques that we have absolutely no knowledge of? The ability to produce construction materials that far exceed anything we can begin to imagine. And we're not even talking about the original Rossendale cement, or the Rossendale concrete as we called it, or the Roman concrete. We're talking about something even more advanced than that. And here we have the depiction that shows us what the original pyramids supposedly looked like. And there's no doubt that they had this level of grandeur. Perhaps they had even more grandeur. Maybe they were coated in something that looked like gold. We'll still certainly consider all the other theories that we have, even though the Five Eras theory seems to be quite solid, at least from our observations. The important thing is that we retain open minds. While we're visualizing what the previous eras, especially the Foundation eras, may have appeared like, what we're going off of for our evidence is some of the foundation rocks that we have, many of the other impressive structures that no doubt existed in these previous civilizations. What we see remain are not the full structures in their glory. We see the smaller structures that have somehow survived the passage of time and at least 2, perhaps 3 resets. And something else I'll concede with this 5 eras theory. For all we know, there could have been many more eras. There could have been 10, there could have been 20, there could have been 30, or even 100. And another question might be, well, how exactly does other timelines fit into this 5 eras theory? Well, when you consider the fact that San Francisco is considered to be one of the most exquisite cities of our current civilization, and yet nothing about it even compares with what we had in the past. Finally, let's consider the first era. The first era seems to be the era that we have the greatest difficulty imagining. And the reason for that is because the first era, no doubt, reflected the greatest balance It's safe to say that a lot of what we have in our current civilization encourages us not to ever believe that there were buildings that were the size of mountains, even though we're told that in the future we'll envision buildings that are the size of mountains, and architects supposedly already have. Or did they derive this inspiration from something that existed in the past and was described in the past? Described in many different old accounts of structures that were so large that they actually exceeded the size of mountains. We even have the account of the Beacon of Progress, supposedly just a drawing, a sketch, a concept for an incredible monument that was going to be reflected in the Chicago World's Fair, along with many other wondrous structures. We also have the religious accounts of the great religions of the land that tell us of great cities and celestial kingdoms in the past. Are they really referring to the actual celestial kingdom? Or are they referring to cities that may have existed? Cities in the distant past that really were of a grander and greater glory than we can ever imagine. Because we had a civilization of individuals that had achieved balance between both their individual desires and the needs and wants of a society. You might look at rock faces such as this and you would think, no, it's merely a natural formation. Or perhaps it reflects some sort of old, large tree. And perhaps it does. However, there's another approach that you could say it reflects a once great and amazing structure that's been through 4 or 5 hard resets, or maybe more. The difficult thing about envisioning the first era is the fact that we've had many resets and it's been a long time. Now, how long is that exactly? The main question might be, how many years do I envision in these 5 eras total? Well, we just don't know, and I know that's not the answer that anybody would want, but that's the honest answer, because we talked about in the date paradox how we don't know how many years have passed. We don't know how many years are in each of these eras. 1,000 years? 5,000 years? 5 million years? Could the entire 5 eras only be 6,000 years? Or could it be many more, 600,000 years? Is it a millennial reign of only 1,000 years, or is it a millennial reign of 1,000 centuries? Or even a far greater amount of time? We just don't know. And the difficult thing with considering time is how quickly things can become obscured, where we're reliant on other people, governments, institutions that were told relentlessly by other historical authorities that were corrupt, that were, excuse the pun, evil. Evil in every way, shape, and form, and yet we're supposed to believe that they preserved an accurate account of history to hand down to us? Because even if you prescribe to the mindset that all of our current governments and civilizations are completely incorruptible and everything they do is for the good and represents the will of the people, regardless of national divisions that we're constantly given, how exactly can you accept the fact that previous civilizations and governments that existed handed us an honest account? I suppose what I'm saying is the 5 eras theory is the best way that we can visualize what may have come before. And I'm always open to revising it and reconsidering it. And as we continue our explorations, we're going to primarily consider the 5 eras theory, because it does seem to explain a lot of the inconsistencies that we have. Now, if you want to reference one particular publication, one particular guide, or what one certain researcher says, that's completely up to you. And I completely request that everybody in the comments tell me what your honest thoughts are. What do you believe? Where do you think the 5 eras fits into the actual history? Is it honest? Is it accurate? Or do we have other difficulties? Do we have other complexities that we need to consider within what the actual timeline is? The last thing I'm ever going to do, though, is simply give up and stop asking questions and stop exploring. Because we've already learned so much, and we've already learned to see the world in a very different way. And of course, there's going to be people, there'll even be institutions that'll tell us that we shouldn't see the world in this way. What did the collapse of the first era really look like? We can imagine it. We can believe it was brought about by some hard natural force, or maybe it was brought about by a natural force and the internal corruption of the people on a long enough timeline. It is indeed a recurring theme in virtually every cultural and religious account that we have in our modern era. Consider what was really lost in the past. And I think that's the greatest theme of this research going forward, and this is why this is a very exciting exploration that we continue. As we go forward, all these theories are just as valid as any other theory, and I don't really have any evidence that discounts any particular theory. Although I will admit it's very difficult to prove the theory that everything is just exactly as we're told it is, and history is exactly correct in every minute detail, even though we relentlessly discuss the problems with that. Well, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the 5 eras. Please like, comment, and subscribe. One of the most obvious pieces of evidence to me is whenever we go across the land and we see beautiful buildings like this, such as the state capitol in Iowa. This is the baseline building for my research on this channel, and the reason for that, it's a building that shouldn't exist there. I think of civilizations as running up a tower. You're always looking to get to the top of the tower as fast as you can, and you're expending a lot of energy to do so. But think of all the previous civilizations that have existed in our lands. I suspect there's 5 eras, but there could be many more. What happens when they reach the top of the tower? Are they able to stay at the top of the tower, or do they fall? Greetings. The 5 eras theory is one of the theories that I use to try to formulate and visualize how the lands could have looked in the past. We have no idea what the actual history is. Yes, we're given a historical account, but we have many inconsistencies in it and we see many contradictions. The portion of the 5 eras theory that I bring up here, though, is dividing it up into looking at how our civilization came to where it is. We start with the Golden Age. And the Golden Age consists of the first 3 eras. Now, there are many cultures that have a division of 5 eras that are across the land, and this is the reason why I picked 5 eras. I don't know. There could be many more, there could be many less. Many things were possible in the Golden Age. Human beings were much more advanced and much more developed spiritually, and they could achieve great architectural achievements. I also believe that in the 3rd era is where the Star Fort builders came from. We're now in our contemporary age, or what others might call the Iron Age, or we jokingly refer to as the Plastic Age. And we call it that because everything is very disposable. And it seems as though we can feel internally that this era that we live in now does not match what was in the past. Although we'll be ridiculed for this, even though there's a lot of evidence that suggests otherwise. Today we're going to be looking at the Tartarian Age, or the 4th era. Now, I call this the Tartarian Age, and there are many alternative researchers that are saying we shouldn't be using this term all the time. It's just a name that's associated with it, a worldwide civilization that existed before our own. But what did it really look like? Well, we have to go back and revisualize the other eras. The first era, the Golden Age, where pretty much anything was possible, where human beings lived exceptionally long lifetimes, and they had an infinite spiritual health. They understood themselves, they understood their environment, and they existed in a wonderful balance with it. Not the promises of balances, but true balances. And their architectural achievements were stunning. They could build buildings that reached to the very clouds, and who knows, perhaps the very nature of the land is very different than we can imagine. It's not just buildings, it could have been vast flora and fauna that existed. And there's a reason why they try to tie this in with explanations of things existing many millions of years ago. But who knows what the actual timeline is? Was this first era of the Golden Age 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago? We don't really have any way to know. And the only remnants we see of this are in great rocks and in certain areas of the land where we have hints of once great buildings that existed in the very distant past. Or maybe it wasn't such a distant past after all, because the forces that destroyed these buildings and leveled the land are things that we cannot understand. But we can certainly speculate on them. The whole point behind the first era of the Golden Age is to understand that in the very beginning, we believe that human beings were exceptionally developed. Now, this theory could be completely wrong, but the evidence that backs it up is whenever you go across the land and you find evidence of melted buildings, vast structures that once covered the land. And on this channel, we explored the Castle Rock ruins in Wisconsin, and we saw that there were hints of vast structures that once existed there that had to be larger than we could possibly imagine. We also see structures such as Devil's Tower. It may have once been a large tree, or it may have once been a large structure, or something else. In the second era, we postulate a civilization that existed, rising from the ashes of the first era. Now, others may call this the Silver Age, and we'll review what this really was when we look at the Greek theory of the 5 ages. However, the second era, this is where we suspect the pyramid builders really came from. And we think of the original pyramids, or the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. They were simply smaller satellite pyramids. We have evidence of much larger pyramids that are built across the land. And in my theories on this channel, I believe that this came from a second era, or a civilization that was still in a golden age, but in a different portion of a golden age. They constructed pyramids because it was a geometrically sound structure, and it also showed their connection to the land. And we don't fully understand what kind of technology that was available both in the construction of these pyramids, and then how they factored into the overall society and the use of such technology. But we suspect that these buildings also developed the internal human being. They supported the spiritual health of the person, and not just provided a structure for societal use. It's a very interesting balance to think of. A building that serves society, but at the same time serves the individual. It seems as though our modern buildings oftentimes deprive us of our spiritual health, and they're very, how shall we say, not even remotely aesthetically pleasing. They're just there to be there and serve a function. The third era, which is another era and the last era of the Golden Age, that followed the pyramid builders. And this was an era where we believe that the civilization advanced to building the great star forts, where they could manipulate the land and the structures and integrate them accordingly. No one really knows what heights this civilization reached, but we can speculate that they had tremendous capabilities to build towers to the very sky. They also had the ability to form and shape the land in geometrical configurations that endure to this day. We can see the remnants of this civilization everywhere we look across the lands. There are star forts everywhere. There are also star forts that are integrated in the very land. We also have the theories about how the land is shaped in many places, where we see large sandbars that extend for many miles on the coasts in many lands across the realm. Now we look at our current era, the 5th era, the Plastic Age, and we see that none of what it is really compares to what we had in the past. We have tall towers of glass and steel, yet they give the impression of being very cheap and disposable. They also show us the fact that our civilization just seems to be something that's readily thrown away and can be thrown away. We also have to remember that we have many, many images of destruction from films, television shows. But today we're going to look specifically at the 4th era, the Tartarian civilization, or the civilization that preceded ours. We want to get an idea of what heights they reached, what was the maximum extent of their capabilities. Because this is the civilization that we see the most defined and detailed remnants of, such as the Iowa State Capitol, the many other beautiful state capitol buildings, the Art Deco buildings, all these buildings that we look at and all these city explorations that we do, they reflect the remnants of the 4th era. Now, let's look at the Tartarian 4th era civilization. And remember, Tartaria is just a term that I assigned to it. The civilization could have been called something completely different. Here's a possible timeline. Break it down into 3 eras, if you will, or 3 portions, 3 phases. An inception and a rising phase, an ascendancy in the height of their civilization, and then a decline and a fall. How long were each of these phases of this Tartarian civilization? We just don't know. They could be 1,000 years. They could be 100 years. We seem to have a great obsession with 1,000 years, and it's probably because it's a nice round number. What did this really look like, though? The main component of this theory is we have to consider the society that existed in this worldwide civilization, their culture, their values, their capabilities, and then ultimately their vulnerabilities. How was it they fell? When they rose, it was clear that they had remnants of the previous era, the 3rd era. But we suspect that the 3rd era endured a great reset or some sort of cataclysm. Looking at what this civilization looked like during its height, we have to think on the integration potentially of pyramid buildings, great towers and domes that reach to the very sky. They had energy capabilities and the ability to generate energy, both from the atmosphere, and then we've also speculated that they had some sort of crystal power source. They may have had many other sources of energy that they were able to draw from, because it's energy that allowed them to build a great society and civilization. Yet at the same time, we speculate that they had a balance that they achieved between the society and the individual. Harvesting this energy may have well reflected that balance in the fact that they were able to understand the energy that they could harvest from both the land and the very air in the atmosphere, and at the same time the energy that existed beneath the land. It seems as though this gave them the capability, along with their developed cultural and societal understanding, to achieve great constructions beyond our wildest dreams. We only see the bare bones remnants of many of these wonderful structures. Think on the fact that we have diagrams and sketches that show us these incredible buildings at their very height. Yet we take this to even what many would consider a science fiction imaging or imagery of what the society may have looked like at their very height. They had airships, they had vast tall buildings across the land. They had cities that stretched for many, many miles, much larger than the cities that we see today. And their structures were built to be enduring, to last. And of course you'll ask, well, exactly how did such a large signature of such a civilization fall? Why is it not with us? We don't understand the capabilities that were used to destroy it. We suspect that there was some sort of force or threat that arose in the land that either defeated the civilization internally or externally. A lot of the hints that we have, though, indicate that it was defeated internally. Initially in the conflict, the civilization won in an external conflict. Now, what do we mean by an internal conflict? This adversary found some sort of way to infiltrate the very beings of people and turn them against the civilization. We look at the great beauty at the very height, imagining a civilization that was in total balance. And it's not just the balance between society and the individual, it's also the understanding of the many cultural groups that no doubt existed in this civilization. They were able to exist in a harmonious nature. And we might reflect on the fact that it seems as though everything in our current civilization operates to turn us against each other through any visual difference or any sort of difference, be it a perceived economic, political, or whatever, to keep us at each other's throats. We look at some of the other possibilities of the previous civilization. Great airships with no limits in their traveling capacity. Great airships that could travel the land very quickly and efficiently. There's been a lot of speculation about airplanes recently, and perhaps the reality behind airplanes and jets is that they use some remnant of this technology, and that's why they appear to take off and land so slowly, almost as though they're hovering in a way and they don't operate in the manner that we're told. Yet we look at these great images of these airships and their vast hangars, and again we still see the remnants of this technology scattered across the land. This is what will be shown airship hangars looked like in the 1920s. The fact being, though, is that this did really exist. It causes us to question if the capacity behind this, though, is far greater than we're shown. That this is merely the bare bones remnants of it, the only portions of the technology that they could return to operational capacity. It's interesting to me that we even have accounts that question the existence and the veracity of these airships docking with tall buildings and tall structures. Some cities, such as Tulsa, even completely deny the account that an airship ever docked with any tall structure in the city. Yet there are other accounts within the history of aviation that shows that this is very true, and this was far more commonplace than they'd like us to think now. We consider the fact that there's been a very defined attack on airships. Now we visualize the decline of this previous civilization. If we suspect that they won a physical external war against some unknown enemy, we have to realize that the unknown enemy changed its tactics and infiltrated the civilization itself by corrupting human beings from the inside. As a result, they began to corrupt the very facets that kept the civilization propped up, considering the fact that the civilization was based on an effective government that actually worked in the interests of the people. That was probably one of the first things that changed. The government then became self-serving, or serving the purposes and intentions of the exterior force that infiltrated it. Therefore, they began to turn the civilization against one another, emphasizing every single physical, social, and economic difference, whether they were real or not. Even the perceived differences, the ideals, caused these people to begin to distrust one another, and gradually their civilization began to erode from the inside out. The great buildings were no longer maintained, the energy systems were neglected. People began to even question their once great purpose in life, and achieving the very pinnacle of human being. They began to turn away from that. And you can find evidence in that in every single account from every civilization and culture that exists on the land today. that people were corrupted. Eventually, it became a point to where the civilization could no longer defend itself from an external threat, and either using some natural cataclysm or perhaps an unnatural cataclysm, an artificial attack using weapons beyond our greatest imagination, they were able to destroy and wreck many of the greatest structures of the civilization that preceded ours. And we have numerous stories of destruction of great edifices in the past, wondrous cities that were reduced to nothing, melted to ash and rubble, and we really don't see any remnants of it today. We think that perhaps the great fires that we read about that seem to dot every single city in the 19th century may have been the finalized destruction of the great structures that remained. We also consider the fact that we have many tales from both biblical and mainstream accounts of vast destruction in the past, even as recently as the 20th century, considering the Tunguska event in Siberia, and even the destruction of the Bronx, which occurred supposedly as late as the 1970s and the early 1980s. Yet the concept of fire from the sky is something that we have to take a lot more seriously. There had to be some great force that was employed, and that's how many of the greatest structures that once existed were utterly annihilated. And here's an image of what remains of the Castle Rock ruins, as I called it, in Wisconsin. Yet you can see it's the remnants of once great buildings. Now I suspect that this is from an earlier era, but this could be as recently as the last era, the Fourth Era, or the Tartarian civilization. We just don't know. So we have to operate on speculation and try to put the pieces together to put together the overall story of what really happened. And why do I suspect that these ruins are much older and are actually the ruins of these great buildings? Well, it's because of the fact that you can't really get an idea of the structures, but you still see signs of symmetry in these ruins. And these signs of symmetry and the vast magnitude that they reflected had to be the once great structures of the First Era. The structures that reached to the very clouds, the legends that we have of such edifices as the Tower of Babel. Yet there are many other accounts that indicate that there were once very large structures that existed, again through societies and cultures across the land, and we'll be told it was merely the work of the gods. This is a idealized depiction of the Golden Age from the Greek account of the Golden Age. And they have a different breakdown of the 5 eras, or the 5 portions of civilization. The Golden Age, the human beings lived amongst the gods, they lived for hundreds of years, and their spirits endured even after they died. They never grew old. Now, is that a reality, or is that just something that we're told to convince us to believe in it? It's ultimately up for you to decide. Of course, now we'll be told that a golden age can be reached again with our technology, and we've always been promised this great future. Although as time passes, we see that no great future is ever delivered to us. We can see that our society continues to grow more disposable. It continues to be something that just feels as though that the quality of service and the quality of life is decreasing. Of course, you'll be told that you're wrong and the quality of life is increasing. However, anybody who has any self-awareness and is capable of thinking for themselves can see that the quality of life is declining. It's not the Garden of Eden. It's not this idealized existence. That just seems to be a false promise that we're given in our current state of being. Did it exist in the past? Well, it must have, because we have accounts of it. And we are constantly detracted or deterred from even trying to visualize this. And we are not encouraged to think that this existed in the past. As though someone doesn't want us to even be able to visualize how great society can be. We have numerous depictions and allusions to things such as a fountain of youth. And why is that so alluring to us? Why is it we fear aging and death so much? Even in the Golden Age, death was a part of life. Apparently aging was not, according to the accounts that we have. Now, whether they're true or not is irrelevant. We still have this perception that the fear of life comes from the ultimate fear of death and the fear of aging. And you can see many examples of how both these fears are used time and time again. We also have accounts of great civilizations that may or may not have existed, such as the legendary kingdom of Prester John. We're told that this was merely a myth that motivated European explorers to go across the land and try to attempt to locate what they believed was an ally to Christendom in the distant past. Yet, looking at some of the accounts of Prester John, it almost feels as though we're given accounts of a remnant or an enclave, an organized enclave of the Tartarian civilization or the Fourth Era that somehow survived the reset and continued to exist, and may have existed much closer to the contemporary era than we like to think. Naturally, it was targeted and destroyed over time, and perhaps these are what the Great Campaigns or the Massive Reset War that we speculated occurred in the 19th century may have been all about destroying. These enclaves that existed across the land, and perhaps the enclave of Prester John, or whatever the real name was of the individual or society that existed there. Yet looking around, we still see many of the bare bones remnants of the previous civilization, and it's everywhere. Such as here in New Orleans, where you'll see a lot of accounts and a lot of images that show that great advanced buildings existed there. Defenders of the mainstream account will tell us, well, it was simply part of the great French presence that existed in North America, and that they forfeited it when they sold it as part of the Louisiana Purchase because of the Napoleonic Wars, which are a very questionable event in and of themselves. Yet we see many of these buildings, and while they may be smaller in scale, we suspect that these buildings are the remnants of the previous civilization, that they reflected their greatness. Now, this is a building that supposedly preceded the Art Deco era in Cleveland, and yet we see such beauty and amazing architectural achievement with it, with the pediment and the columns, and even the height and the beauty and the artistic desire of it. Perhaps this was just a small administrative building that existed in the previous civilization, or the Marble Room going back to Cleveland. A beautiful, amazing place to dine, which, again, displays the connection between a society and an individual. A place where you can go and interact with other individuals and at the same time feel your internal being strengthened just by being present in this room. And during the exploration of this particular room, I joked that even a McDonald's hamburger would taste like fine dining if you had this kind of atmosphere and environment that you're eating it in. We also see the remaining state capitals. And we have no doubt that these are clearly the remaining buildings of the previous civilization. Perhaps they were low-level administration buildings, or they were regional administration buildings that survived whatever targeted effects of the last reset occurred, whether that was some sort of artificial weapon, a directed energy weapon, or some other power means that we don't understand. Perhaps the very technology of the previous civilization was subverted and used against it, which we speculated was cymatics. We see images of the current age, also called the Iron Age, or what we call the Plastic Age, which states that people are born with gray hair, that people age rapidly, and they live a very harsh lifestyle, and that the only people who aspire to greatness are the people who are the most proficient at lying. And we see a lot of truth in this. We see a lot of truth in this in our contemporary society, and also in the accounts that we have of the past, where a society or a civilization is subverted by its own ruthless desires. We also think of all the images that we have of utterly destroyed cities, which again reinforces the notion that the previous civilization was completely annihilated, that many of their great buildings were destroyed, and only certain buildings managed to survive this reset. Of course, this is from St. Louis, and we have a mainstream account that's utterly silly in my mind, that a steamboat or a paddle steamer started this fire because it crashed into other boats on the river, and then it crashed into buildings somehow and started a great conflagration. We also have the Chicago fire, and we see immense images of apocalyptic destruction from the Chicago fire. Somehow the city was quickly built in a short period of time. The Chicago fire occurred in the 1870s, and then they quickly rebuilt it, to the point to where they were ready to have the greatest World's Fair of all time in the 1890s. Now, if you want to believe this mainstream account, that's entirely up to you, and maybe you think this is credible. Maybe you think these kind of amazing feats in logistics are possible because people worked hard, and if they didn't work hard, they starved and they died. Yet, I find this account very hard to believe, and I find it much more likely that these are images of the last phases of destruction of the previous civilization, where they were targeting any buildings that would be too difficult to explain, or buildings that they could not convincingly repurpose and put in a presupposed narrative. Now, yes, we say narrative, and that term gets a lot of derisive attitude towards it, and rightfully so. However, it is a narrative. It is an account that we're supposed to believe. And the whole point behind it is to cause us to not have any understanding of our true history. Because if we don't know our true history, then we don't know our true identity. Our identity can be shaped to whatever power that truly rules the land wants our identity to be. We're simply nothing. We're creatures who have no greater spiritual health or existence, and we exist for their very pleasure, to be used and discarded as soon as we're done. And they'll openly admit this too in mainstream accounts. Yet we look back to the Golden Age, and we realized that there was something much greater. There are accounts that our civilization and our people and our identity was much greater in the distant past. That's the real purpose behind these explorations. It's a journey inward to rediscover the strength that lies within every human being. That's why my approach is not to tell you what to think. You have to decide for yourself what to think. You have to decide for yourself what to believe, who to listen to, and what's really true and real and what's not. And I'm not ever going to insult anyone by insulting what they believe, and if you believe the mainstream account is correct, well then go ahead. It's not going to bother me whatsoever. However, going back to the previous age, there's no doubt that it seemed to be a return to the glories of the distant past. At its very height, the Tartarian age did reach that, with a balance between society and the individual, with a true cultural understanding. Perhaps the story of the Tower of Babel is not so distant or legendary as we like to think. Perhaps it's not reflecting the differences in languages, but simply reflecting the differences in civilizations and cultures, as they've now been inherently divided and are encouraged to be divided by the current ruling powers of the lands. Because it's a lot easier to retain control when you keep people divided. You keep them unaware of what their past is. They live in a state of amnesia, or much worse, they live with a fabricated past. And that's the question people always ask. Why would anybody go to the trouble of doing this? Because you can achieve total control. Now, we haven't really explored who the enemy is, or who really caused all this, the previous fall of civilization and humanity. We're going to explore that in an upcoming video on this channel called The Ancient Enemy. There's going to be some theories involved, but there is a lot of evidence, and that evidence is found in the current actions that we witness every day in the land, for how people are divided, how people may be subverted from within, and what's the true nature of the external threat. Remember that these buildings still exist. They are everywhere. And this is hard evidence that a previous civilization existed. You can go to the Iowa State Capitol, you can touch the internal walls and the external walls, and you can see that this is all true material. It is real and it is still with us everywhere. That's important to remember as we continue our explorations. And that's what we're going to do. Thank you for joining me. Vatican City, the Nexus City in Rome, in Italy, a city within a city. And as we look at St. Peter's Basilica, an example of Renaissance architecture, in the middle of Rome, in the middle of the Vatican, as its primary edifice, we're looking at the largest church in the world. We're looking at the church with the largest area and the largest capacity. There's nothing else that even comes close to this incredible edifice. The seat of the Holy See is what the Vatican is. Yet this is a city that's a nexus of so many different things. A nexus of histories from the mainstream account. A nexus of cultures and societies. Everything exists within the Vatican. And yet it's a very small area. We have many aspects of the Roman Empire that are integrated within Rome and around the Vatican. And that's what we mean when we talk about it being a nexus of empires and civilizations. Come join me as we begin our exploration of the Vatican, explaining the mystery of the Nexus City. Welcome. The area of the Vatican is extremely constrained. When you consider the vast size of St. Peter's Basilica, the actual area of the Vatican is much smaller than the average family farm in the United States. Just over 100 acres. Not quite 0.2 of a square mile. And we even have a geometrically precise foundation structure, or GPFS, instead of the classic name that we use. There are many different accounts of the Vatican, many cross-sections of what it really looks like. Yet looking at the space of it, it's incredible that they're able to fit so many structures. And yet the Vatican, as an independent city-state within Rome, has a population just over 760. You also have accounts of St. Peter's Basilica, or the Basilica of St. Peter's, as being the burial site of St. Peter, one of Jesus' chief apostles. There's cross-sections of the catacombs that exist under St. Peter's, and numerous well-documented maps. Of course, we come across that statement a lot of times, what well-documented really means. And what does well-documented means? It means that there are many records, written records and maps. And do we trust the veracity of those written records? Well, if we do, we may be correct, or we may be incorrect. It's all we have to go on. You can see, though, that with the geometrically precise foundation structure, Castle St. Angelo, or the Mausoleum of Hadrian as it was originally known, is not actually part of the Vatican. However, it's within the same area. And looking at the Vatican, we can see that they have compressed many buildings around St. Peter's Basilica and the entire organization of the Catholic Church. It's also intriguing to consider the history of the Vatican in the fact that it was originally just a small swampland as part of the old city of Rome that eventually rose to its chief paramount position as the head of the Catholic Church. And looking at this aerial imagery of St. Peter's, you can see it almost looks like a machine. And once again, we have geometrically precise foundation structures. Very intriguing. A lot of our historical documentation revolves around paintings and drawings. And people will say, why do you call these pictures? Well, because technically there are pictures. What you're looking at right now is a picture as well. One's a photograph, one's a drawing, one's a painting. But they're all technically pictures. And yet we need to question every single one. They may be completely accurate, or they may be inaccurate. There are many mysteries that revolve around the Vatican, this impressive city-state that exists in the middle of one of the greatest and oldest cities in the world. And St. Peter's being the largest and most impressive church in the world, especially from the Catholic Church perspective. Yet there's an interesting historical account about the fact that this architecture was the first new architecture in the city of Rome since the old Roman Empire. In other words, they tell us that the Romans fell apart and disintegrated. They didn't build buildings and bridges and all their other great infrastructural achievements anymore. And it wasn't until the Renaissance, a period of new learning in Europe centered around Italy, that happened in the 15 to the 1600s, and we'll omit the use of centuries because that just gets confusing as it's intended to do. And because of this new period of learning, this new period of cultural infusion, they were able to pick up these great building techniques again, these wonderful masters of Renaissance. And of course, it's considered a great compliment to be considered a Renaissance person from this time frame. You are someone who is of great learning. It's incredible to think that in an area that's not even 1/5 of a square mile, that all these different structures and all these different integrations and intersections of society and culture exist. The other intriguing thing is that if we consider the fact that our true recorded history that we can rely on a little bit more starts in the 19th century, as alternative researchers suggest, that the papal states, in other words, the Pope or the Bishop of Rome, which was the original hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church, they actually had their own lands that were in the center of Italy. And these lands were seized by the Italian government at the time, or the King of Italy in the 19th century. And that seemed to be the status quo. And they respected the territorial integrity of this Vatican city-state until it was recognized in a treaty in 1929. A treaty that was presented by this gentleman in Italy, you may have heard of him, known as Benito Mussolini. After this, it's operated as its own independent city-state. An impressive series of buildings and structures and a complete overlap and intersection of society, culture, and knowledge, all in one very small area that just happens to have the largest church in the world located within it, and an infinite amount of records, and yet only 700 people. When we look across at some of the older records of the Vatican, at least the pictorial records, and of course I mean actual images that are shot with camera, we can see that there's been little change. We see the structures that we've seen in our other explorations, the great pediments, the columns and domes, and this isn't surprising here because this is Rome, and of course they had a lot of time, and they had the geniuses of the Renaissance. There's also a map that you can navigate that'll really show you how complicated the layout of the Vatican is, and it is very impressive, such as the unique gate here. There's also unique architecture within every single building and every single structure. Most of the buildings in the Vatican were reputed to have been constructed during the Renaissance era, or, in simple terms, the 15 to the 1600s. Here's the Holy Office, where we see the greatest authorities of the Church in Rome operate. And even on the side of this building, you can see some of the architectural stylings that we've seen. And, of course, the Apostolic Library, or the Vatican Library. And looking on the outside of these buildings, there's an entirely different story when you look at the interior. Here's the courtyard of the library, and you can see that it's deceptive. There's a lot more space and area on the interior than one would think, even in such a compressed area as Vatican City. And here you have the papal residence, where the Pope resides. Very interesting and intricate tower next to it, and every single window having the pediment over it, it appears. And then the Sistine Chapel. And everyone's heard of the Sistine Chapel, but this is where it's actually located in relation to St. Peter's. A very incredible, complex, and compilation of buildings in a very small area, and yet precise geometric patterns that we have many other names and references for, and yet you see this in the Vatican. The four gates. Everywhere you look. And yet, once again, there's interesting anomalies, such as that small sphere that we'll take a closer look at, located within the Vatican. The Tower of Nicholas V, referring to the earlier tower that we looked at. It's also an interesting consideration when we think of the layout of this city during the Renaissance period, in terms of how they managed to construct all these buildings and lay out this very complex and intricate series of structures. Without a doubt, it's safe to say that the Vatican is one of the most complicated compounds in the world. Yet there is no shortage of unique art depicting some sort of struggle that occurred in the distant past. And many will say that it's simply the warnings that come from the Catholic Church if you don't abide by your proper spiritual health. The interiors of the Vatican are where the true story is to be found, where you see some of the most beautiful and elaborate interior structures that you could ever imagine. Yet when you look at the outside, you see what appears to be an interesting juxtaposition of architectural stylings. Rome wasn't exactly known for its domes outside of the Pantheon, and yet we find some of the most elaborate domes that were constructed during the Renaissance period, by Michelangelo no less. When you also look at the entrance of the Vatican Museum, you see the juxtaposition of styles and that odd sphere within a sphere. Very unique, and very unique that such a sphere would be placed in a series of what we would consider classic old world buildings. What's the real purpose behind this sphere? What do you think this represents? And why are we focusing on this sphere? Because this is something that really stands out. It's a visual anomaly within everything else that we see within the Vatican. Why was this sphere approved to be placed here? Was it just a work of art? We also have the history of the Vatican during World War II, and we're told that the Pope wanted to keep the Vatican and Rome as neutral as possible to save the area from bombing. And there's no doubt that there was some very destructive bombing campaigns that occurred during World War II. And here, looking at the great courtyard in front of St. Peter's Square, where you can fit tens of thousands of people. We look at the entrance of the Vatican Museum, and now we consider the Vatican Museum a grandeur and considered to be one of the most impressive museums in the world. And why not? It has a classic spiral staircase. And if you study monasteries and abbeys, you'll notice that the spiral staircase seems to be something that's repeated many times in this architectural styling. These complexities of access to a building. Something that shows us a time long past in terms of how we could lay out buildings. Yet we don't see spiral staircases favored in modern architecture. And the interior of the museum, and get used to these images because this is exactly what you're going to see as we look in the interior of all these buildings across the Vatican. Beautiful art, columns, arches, floors. And if you go to the Vatican in person, one thing you'll find yourself almost in a personal crisis about is how can such immense beauty exist in such a small area? And it is impressive how it's all fit together. The interior of all these buildings and the complex layouts almost reflect some sort of society that's more advanced and more difficult to explain. And the story of the Vatican obelisk. This originally was an obelisk that existed in Egypt in the distant past. And under the orders of a Roman emperor, it was brought to Rome on a ship because apparently it was very easy to bring an entire obelisk on a ship across the Mediterranean in the distant past. Well, the Pope in the early Renaissance period, 14 to 1500s, didn't really care for the location of the obelisk and wanted it moved to a position in front of St. Peter's. And that's old St. Peter's. This is just a drawing of it because obviously we have no pictures, as photography hadn't been invented during the Renaissance time yet. And we have this account of how this obelisk was originally brought over during Roman times across the Mediterranean Sea, and then how it was moved, albeit very difficultly, from one position to another in Rome. Interesting that this obelisk, and there are many obelisks you'll find across the greater city of Rome. Some are stated to be Egyptian obelisks that they brought over from the Mediterranean, and others are obelisks that the Romans themselves supposedly constructed. It's an intriguing account, though, and how much effort really went into moving this. And they do have it well documented, if you consider a painting of something being well documented. And this obelisk is the centerpiece of the courtyard, where you can see thousands or even tens of thousands of people gathered around during papal ceremonies. Very interesting layout of geometrical precision that still endures to this day with this obelisk. You'd almost have the impression that it was there much longer than what we're told. And what do obelisks really represent? What do they really mean? Do they simply represent a reference of the Holy Church in Rome recognizing the greatness of Egyptian civilization? Interestingly enough, there are no hieroglyphics on this particular obelisk, although if you look at other obelisks across Rome, you will find hieroglyphics on them. So it's hard to say what's really going on. Yes, we have our well-documented official historical account, and I suppose when we have numerous inconsistencies, we're just supposed to accept it. But I'm not one who simply accepts explanations simply, especially when there's contradictions. Now let's take a look at the Sistine Chapel. You've no doubt heard about the beauty of the Sistine Chapel. And it's not so much for its incredible structure or architecture, although it is impressive. It's for the paintings that were reputed to have been done by Michelangelo. And indeed, the official historical account says that Michelangelo worked tirelessly on all these paintings. It took him 4 years to paint the interior of the Sistine Chapel. The interesting thing is when you look into the achievements of Michelangelo, most people think of him as a sculptor. Painting was not his forte, and yet he did one of the most famous frescoes in the world, seen right here in the Sistine Chapel. We have a historical account that talks about some of the political maneuvering and personal feelings that caused this situation to happen. And yet Michelangelo became, well, you could really say he was one of the essential individuals from the 1500s to really take part not just in the painting of this incredible fresco in the Sistine Chapel, but also he was an architect in his spare time. And indeed, his architectural designs were factored into St. Peter's. Talk about a true Renaissance person. I wonder if he was spending all his time painting, which we're told it took him 4 years to achieve these incredible paintings in the Sistine Chapel, how did he keep up on his architectural prowess? And it's very difficult to find exactly who he studied under, but we could just say that maybe that wasn't so well documented. And that's understandable. Was he reading Architectural Weekly's Digest of the Renaissance Man in the 1500s? And as he was busy painting every single day the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he managed to keep up on his architectural capabilities. It's very impressive. And there was a movement in art called Mannerism that tried to replicate the very lifelike renderings of Michelangelo. And obviously, you won't see something like this today. And this is potentially how he worked for 4 years, on his back, laboring away on these incredible paintings, these incredible depictions in the Sistine Chapel. And you can see that there are other aspects to the Sistine Chapel. Again, the impressive architecture, And of course, we recognize that design in the floor, which should be quite familiar to us by now. If you ever go to the Vatican and you see the Sistine Chapel, you'll find yourself completely overwhelmed by just the amount of artistic inspiration when you see it in person. And this is probably one of the most famous paintings, or at least one of the figures, or two of the figures, representing creation. And there's so many other aspects to it. Well, let's take a look at the Basilica of St. Peter, continuing on with the trappings of Michelangelo. Now, we're told that the original Basilica of St. Peter was eroding and rotting in the late 1400s, and the Pope desired to construct a new St. Peter's. Now, there were 4 architects that were supposedly involved in this, and the most famous being Michelangelo. He was brought on board, and he was late in his life, and he was the one who designed the dome. And even though he passed away in the mid-1500s and the actual St. Peter's Basilica was not finished until the early 1600s, his design was just that good that they were able to complete it. And indeed, there is no church since then that's ever matched this church, this basilica. And it should be noted it's not a cathedral, as it's technically not a residence of a bishop, which is the supposed Catholic definition of a cathedral. Yet, by far and away, this is the largest church in the world in terms of interior area and capacity. The layout on it is very impressive, and when you look at it in aerial imagery from above, it almost looks as though it's some sort of gigantic machine. And perhaps it does serve as some sort of machine. You can see how people would be completely awed by the wonder of divine inspiration when they gaze upon this edifice. Looking on its many domes, although it was supposed to have more domes, and there's only 2 subsidiary domes with the main dome when you look at it from above, so it's hard to say what exactly was going on. And it's explained by the fact that there were 4 architects involved in the design of St. Peter's. A very impressive architectural and construction achievement from the 1500s to the 1600s. And while they say it took 120 years to build, that's still an impressive timeline. Here are some of the other designs that we can look at when we consider St. Peter's. The interesting thing about this particular design, though, is that we can see that one of the other architects had a slightly different rendering or concept for it. Indeed, you can even get some of the ideas as to how it looked like a state capitol when it was originally designed. And perhaps that might be blasphemous to say or suggest, but, when it looks like something, it looks like something. And I always asked the question when I studied this originally in my history course, and then when I taught this, how exactly was the church so uncertain and indecisive about exactly what it wanted for its design? And yet you can see there were other designs submitted that showed wondrous architectural achievement and prowess. And one of the questions I asked that would get myself in trouble was, how exactly were they able to pick up the designs in the Renaissance so easily? The sketch of the dome is very intriguing in and of itself because it's supposed to give us an idea of the cross-section, and yet it's interesting to consider that domes aren't favored today. We have these very unique and lifelike statues that are also situated within St. Peter's, and every single one of them seems to represent the divine inspiration of the church, and also the belief in Jesus and the apostles. And you can see why this incredible edifice with these wondrous, lifelike statues could certainly induce and incite such beliefs within people. When you gaze upon these statues in person, you're always left with a question that was from the movie Gladiator. I didn't know that men could build such things. And I'll admit that's a feeling that I had when I actually walked around the Vatican, and not just within St. Peter's, but in every aspect of it. Now that is a big door. What exactly is the purpose behind such a big door? Well, we just stated. It's to give you that feeling of awe-inspiring as you go into the church. And these are the bronze doors, and of course it's flanked by a couple columns. And once again you have a pediment with a picture on it. There is nothing that is spared within this church, and of course it makes sense as this is indeed the capital of the Roman Church across the lands. And looking up in the dome, and you can see that there are the same architectural stylings that we would see in the so-called neoclassical period. Because how do we explain that these architectural achievements were spread across the land? Well, simple. There were the predecessors of archaeologists, indeed the foremost archaeologists from Europe, who looked at these buildings in Rome and Greece, and then everybody wanted to build buildings like this across the land. And apparently it was as easy as just looking at them, and apparently the records were also stored for hundreds, if not over 1,000 years, and the Renaissance people were able to pick them up and very easily design and build these structures. Even over 100 years, this is the most impressive church in the world, and when you walk in it, you'll just be completely blown away by the size and magnitude, the large cavern quality of the entire church. You completely forget about the fact that you're in a patch of land that is less than 1/5 of a square mile. And look at this, even these vents are very decorative and almost otherworldly. This is supposedly a ventilation system to the catacombs beneath. And then, of course, you see the large decorations across the entire church. The way the light flows into St. Peter's is something that's very difficult to describe. Well, now we look at the Vatican Gallery of Maps. And this is yet another incredible artistic and architectural achievement within the Vatican. The Gallery of Maps, which depicts so many different maps mixed with art, that gives you an impression that there is true knowledge that is to be found within the Vatican. The layout of all these maps, they're not just the most accurate maps in the world at that time, they were also the most artistically inspired. And considering the many different depictions of the Vatican Gallery of Maps, and here we'll look at some of them, you can see that at that time, this was supposed to be the most accurate and most artistically inspired maps available in the world. And even to this day, it seems as though it's difficult to find a comparison. Very incredibly ornate, and yet at the same time, accurate. Almost disturbingly so, because when you go down this gallery of maps, you also see that it's surrounded by incredible architecture that mixes beauty with construction capability. And that's probably the most shocking thing about the Vatican, because even when you go in there knowing exactly what to expect, you'll find that everything about it continues to overwhelm you no matter how much you see. And you don't get over this process, this internal feeling of being overwhelmed, even though you're walking in an area that's barely over 100 acres. It's very astounding, and yet when you pay attention to some of the symbols, such as the sphere or some of these maps, you'll find some interesting clues that come out about what was really going on and what's really being depicted. Now, you can certainly go back and look at these images, and I'll leave a link so you can look at a map of the Vatican yourself and interact exactly, if you're so inclined, with where each of these specific locations are within this little 0.2 square mile area. This hallway, though, feels like something that's, I can't even say it's out of a science fiction or a fantasy movie. This is something that completely defies imagination. And I remember having that same feeling when I walked in it. And of course, you'll see the usual depictions of purgatory, because remember, we are in the Vatican, and people need to be reminded that there is a purgatory. And of course, having a visual representation of it's a wonderful way to remind people there is a purgatory. There's something about the ceiling, though, within this hall that is difficult to describe in words, and I think it's just best to show it in pictures. Here we have the Battle of Lepanto, the great struggle between the Ottomans and the Holy League, led by Don John of Austria. This was supposedly a great Catholic victory in the distant past, and it prevented Ottoman control of the Mediterranean. We also have these other intricate maps that show the layout of the land, and what's most interesting to me, though, is how much emphasis is put on the waterways. And I suppose that makes sense, as that was the only means to travel at the time. But as you walk down this hallway of maps and you gaze on each of these maps in this very impressive hallway, you find that there's something that just reaches you on a deeper level about considering what kind of knowledge is being depicted on these maps. Where did they really come from? What was their actual origin? How is this hallway even constructed? And of course, those are questions that you're not supposed to ask because you're given very logical explanations for them. The logical explanation being is it was the Renaissance and learning had returned to Europe. And because learning had returned to Europe, people such as Michelangelo could be skilled at being sculptors, painters, and architects in their spare time, or perhaps the other expertise were in their spare time, and they managed to lay this out. Well, let's take a look at the Paul VI Audience Hall, the main papal audience hall. Now, this was built in 1971. Now, why are we looking at a newer building? Well, because it's on the Vatican residence area, or within the Vatican itself, and it has a rather peculiar look to it from the outside and on the inside. And it's one of those things that defies expectations in terms of what you'd expect to see in the Vatican. I'm not exactly sure what it looks like. My imagination is eluding me, and, we're not supposed to use our imaginations these days, so I'll just say that it looks like a peculiar building on the outside and on the inside. Now, supposedly it's on the roof of it. It has numerous solar panels that were provided by a German company, free of charge, of course, because making generous donations to the church is something that we'll see you rewarded for. Although I find it interesting that they say that the Kingdom of Italy seized a lot of the papal estates in the 19th century. Ah, yes. Very interesting sculpture that is supposed to depict our Lord and Savior coming out of the flames. Also a curious lack of crosses, but I'm sure they have their reasons. I don't know why, but when I look in the exterior, in the interior of this papal audience hall, I'm reminded of the movie Anaconda. Well, perhaps I just need to watch it again. Supposedly it can fit up to 6,300 people, and I'm often wondering if maybe they were 300 or so people short in terms of the overall capacity. Still, an impressive architectural achievement for the 1970s, and we can see that this was perhaps the Vatican's form of urban renewal in the 1960s and the 1970s. And very interesting, the entire layout of this audience hall, when you look at all the details, exactly where the supporting structures and the pillars are laid out, and just the overall layout of the ceiling. And I even appreciate the fact that the steps run right up to where you have the Pope flanked by the Swiss guards there. And of course that very interesting and unique sculpture in the background. This is definitely something that's supposed to convey the authority of the church, and not just the physical authority, but the spiritual authority. Perhaps the most accurate way to summarize this very intriguing audience hall is to say that it's really representative of the Vatican being a nexus of the past, the present, and the future. Very interesting window design. Once again, I really think I need to go see the movie Anaconda again. It's been so many years since I've seen it. Well, let's take a look at the Apostolic Library, the famous Vatican Library. And the layout of the library, along with the museum, bears a lot of striking architectural similarities and artistic decorations. There's so many things within this library, though, that we could ask questions about. The golden rows, the codices, the books, the manuscripts. Supposedly one of the most well laid out and high volume libraries in the world. And what kind of knowledge really exists within the Vatican? What do they have within their many manuscripts and books? Indeed, author Umberto Eco had access, supposedly, to the Vatican Library, and he was able to bring out a lot of knowledge and records from the distant past and incorporate them within several of his novels. You also see that it's not just a library in terms of how books are laid out, but it's yet another impressive architectural and artistic achievement. Yet many of the books and manuscripts that they have within the Vatican Library are from many different times and many different cultures and societies. So once again, the library itself exists as an edifice and a repository of the knowledge and achievements of human history. This is no doubt why many people see the Vatican Library as the greatest achievement of a library within the world. And even this bridge that leads to the Vatican is a bridge that was constructed during the Renaissance and was stated to be the first bridge constructed during the Roman times, well over 1,000 years earlier. Very interesting, and anyone who is a bibliophile or appreciates books imagines going through the Vatican collection, being able to look at the books. And this is Pope Sixtus VI, the one who is responsible for laying out and ordering the construction of this incredible library that exists to this day. You'll see the same kind of architectural stylings, and of course we can see in the painting back there the moving of the obelisk, which was quite a difficult process during the Renaissance and was also done on ship during Roman times. You can also find no shortage of collections of some of the manuscripts and the books within the library. And we all wonder what books are really available there, what kind of knowledge exists within this library. This is truly something that reaches our attention, and it seems to be something that's designed to get our attention, as well it should. Imagine such a library with such knowledge within it. And in our exploration last week, we considered old world libraries, and we consider the fact that this is probably one of the best, most superficial examples of a surviving library that connects the old world to the contemporary world. And once again, we see the familiar floor design and every single pillar having artistic layout. And of course, it wouldn't be a Vatican library without a depiction of hell, so we had our depiction of purgatory, and now we have our depiction of hell, just so you can get an idea of what it really looks like, because again, you need to visualize it. There's also other things that exist in the library. Old world maps, other layouts of maps, and this is beyond the gallery of maps that we looked at earlier, that you consider what exists within this library. All the different languages and all the knowledge of human achievements from the past, collected in one place. It definitely inspires the imagination, and that's why we'd all like to go to the library. We finish with the Mausoleum of Hadrian, or Casa Sant'Angelo, as it's known as today. A very intriguing Roman architectural achievement. At least that's what the official history will tell us. And here in this overhead imagery, we see the geometrically precise foundation structure, or GPFS as we call them now. Yes, I guess it kind of looks like a star. Looking at the structure, though, this is something that's supposedly well over 1,000 years old, almost 2,000 years old directly, and it seems to be holding up very well. There are numerous cross-sections of it, and we can certainly attribute these cross-sections to the works during the Renaissance. So a cross-section would be something you'd expect somebody to do when they're trying to learn about the construction of something after they've found a building. The interior of this mausoleum is very impressive. As you see, it's a combination of brickwork with Roman concrete at the time. So naturally, it would survive to 2,000. It'll probably survive to be 10,000 years old and will look just the same as it does now. Yes, I'm making a big assumption there, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Do you think that this mausoleum is going to look exactly the same, undisturbed, in another 8,000 years? It's interesting to think of the fact that this building and all these buildings in the Vatican made it through World War II, although we can attribute that to the Pope's neutral stance that neither of the factions in World War II targeted these buildings. There's also a lot of historical paintings that depict these buildings being laid out exactly as they are now. Now, of course, these are just paintings. Anybody could do a painting of anything. But you can still go and walk among these buildings today, and it should be noted that the Mausoleum of Hadrian is not technically part of the Vatican, but it is on the main entry road that runs right into the Basilica of St. Peter. You also see familiar figures, and we'll be told that these figures are added over time to give this mausoleum a more modern Roman Catholic appearance. And of course the Archangel Michael and the other great angels that appear as part of the mausoleum. It's another one of those structures that is not easy to explain when you consider the fact that it shows the intersection of societies and civilizations over time. And yet it's no less impressive. And if you're ever walking the structure in person, you also get the idea of the differences of what are supposed to be intersecting timelines. When the bridge was built, when the different buildings in the Vatican were built, as opposed to these older buildings in Rome. It's not something that you can very easily reconcile within your mind, because what you'll find is these buildings look very similar. You'll also find that the construction materials seem to be of a similar age. Perhaps that's just a misperception. But when you look on the inside of these buildings, whether you're looking in the mausoleum or the Basilica in St. Peter's, you'll find that the similarities seem to be overwhelming. You'll also find that when you look at the geometric precision of a lot of the layout of these buildings, it's not easy to conceptualize how someone could have designed this from the start, let alone how this was supposedly designed over different time frames with hundreds and in some cases 1,000 years between them of laying out all these buildings and all the interiors so precisely. Also the fact that they tell us that a lot of the buildings were built during Roman times, and yet most of the Vatican was supposedly constructed during the Renaissance. So that's how you explain the overall Vatican being a true intersection, a nexus point of different timelines, different societies, and different cultures. And even the mainstream account indicates that that's exactly the case. And when you go there and you see some of these old drawings of what supposedly existed in the distant past in Italy, and even after the Renaissance, it should be noted that there were many destructive conflicts that occurred across Europe. The 30 Years' War, which would mainly constitute the area of Germany that lasted in the 17th century, occurred after the Renaissance. We've seen these layouts before, though, looking back in the Mausoleum of Hadrian with all the bricks, and the view from the mausoleum is no less impressive. We haven't even started to explore the rest of Rome yet, but I thought the Vatican would be a wonderful starting point because if you think about it, it's really the linchpin that connects what used to be the Roman Empire to the Renaissance and to our current times. And yet when you actually explore it, when you go there in person or you look at the images, you have the perception that all of this existed together. So what to say in summary about the Vatican? If you go to the Vatican, you'll never believe that it's such a small area. You also find it difficult to reconcile the fact that there's only 700 residents. And you have the Swiss Guard, which is an independent military force which is assigned to protect the Pope and the other 700 people that live within the Vatican. You have a juxtaposition of old architecture, and yet you have strange anomalies such as the sphere and the papal auditorium, or the papal audience hall, which shows you something different. And you also have this internal view of the Basilica of St. Peter, where you see the natural light, and the way the natural light lights up these incredibly large, open caverns. This is a place that if you visit, it will stay with you. It may be of spiritual divinity, or it may simply be by the perceptions of this incredible achievement of humanity that may well be divinely inspired. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this exploration.